Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Adam Lang. One of the benefits of international trade is access to the open market. Australia exports plenty of goods and services around the world and is fortunate to have a strong democracy, the rule of law, good wages and good working conditions. We also have the benefit of importing commodities from around the world, and we chase the best deals. It's an unfortunate reality that many of the items we buy are from countries with much lower wages and poorer conditions. And sometimes those wages and conditions have been found to be so poor that they are considered exploitative. The Modern Slavery Act of 2018 requires Australian companies to examine and report on their suppliers to ensure that slavery is eradicated and that we play our part in the international picture. It's a tough topic, and it's well worth companies knowing their responsibilities and the reasons why. So I wanted to talk to an expert today to get an insight into the world of modern slavery and how Australian businesses need to help. Deborah Coram is the Chief Executive Officer of Safetrac, Australia's leading compliance platform. Deborah, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure. Deborah, this topic is tough and may well come as something of a shock to some of our listeners. What is modern slavery?
Well, I think the term slavery is probably something everybody's familiar with from a historical perspective, where we know that it encompasses people being forced to work against their will, people being treated as a possession, restricting their freedom of movement, and somehow dehumanising a person and defining them as being owned by somebody else. Well, those type of slavery practices were made illegal largely in the 1800s and most famously, I guess, by the US 13 Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery. But unfortunately, those legislative amendments didn't really end slavery practices. It's just simply caused perpetrators to be more inventive and devious about how they are involved in slavery. So that now we talk about modern slavery, which does not necessarily entail direct ownership of a victim, but rather involves using extreme exploitation to acquire a personal or commercial gain. It is usually a practice that involves some type of control, coercion, threats or deception to exploit victims and undermine their freedoms in order to provide cheap or unpaid labour. Now, there's multiple forms of modern slavery around the world, such as forced labour, bonded labour, debt bondage, domestic servitude, forced child labour, human trafficking, forced harvesting of organs, forced criminality, forced early or sham marriages, unlawful recruitment or use of soldiers, including children. The list goes on. But in effect, modern slavery victims are exploited of their most basic human rights.
So, look, this is pretty dark subject matter, and it might be in corners of the world where we prefer it didn't exist, but it does. And in preparing for this interview, I had a look at the statistics on the slide antislavery.org, and I do recommend that to listeners, as well as, of course, safetrac.com.au. There's an estimated 40 million people around the world trapped in those modern slavery conditions. 1 in 4 of them are children, and 71% are estimated to be female. It's perhaps more prevalent than many of us would ever expect, but how widespread is modern slavery around the world?
Yeah, it's interesting, Adam, because I want to go back again to that historical perspective because It's an interesting comparison. It was estimated that historically around 13 million people were captured and sold as slaves between the 15th and 19th centuries. Yet today, roughly 1 in every 200 people is a slave. That is more than 3 times the figure during the transatlantic slave trade are involved and living in some form of modern slavery. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry with just the forced labour aspect of it being valued at $150 billion each year. We find it most prevalent in very poor countries, North Korea, Africa, followed then by the Asia-Pacific region. And Australia is not exempt from this, Adam. Indeed, it's estimated that in Australia we've got around 15,000 people caught up in it, with around 4.3% of our population being vulnerable to its practices.
So that's in our own backyard.
In our own backyard. And it's really confronting to understand that it involves millions of people each year being bought and sold in public markets, being forced into labour and sham marriages, workplaces and factories where they are effectively imprisoned and forced to work against their will for little or no remuneration. The prevalence of modern slavery is driven through conflict and oppression in these countries, but it's derived in more developed countries from consumer demand for the latest goods at the best possible price.
So these are staggering and confronting issues. And if I can just ask you to stick with the data a little longer.
Yeah.
Are there certain industries, not just the countries that we've talked about and the sorts of conditions where it can exist, are there certain industries where it perhaps infects more than others?
Yeah, look, the practice is widespread and people can become entrapped in these industries, making clothes, serving food, picking crops, working in factories or working in houses as cooks, cleaners and nannies. I think the reality is, though, that the answer to your question changes depending on whether your focus area is based on global total value of goods or the total number of people. So, for example, if we were to just look within Australia, the industries it's most likely to be found involved include agriculture, construction, domestic work, meat processing, cleaning, hospitality and food services. But globally, the majority of those in forced labour work in the private sector, cleaning houses, flats, making the clothes we wear, picking the fruit and vegetables we eat, trawling the seas for the shrimp we so enjoy to eat, digging for minerals used in our smartphones, makeup and electric cars, and working in construction jobs. We've got around 4.8 million people working in forced labour, estimated to be sexually exploited, while roughly 4.1 million people are in state-sanctioned forced labour, which includes governmental abuse of military conscription and forced construction and agricultural work. Unsurprisingly, it's women and girls who bear the brunt of these statistics. They actually comprise around 99% of all victims in the commercial sex industry and 58% in the other sectors.
So I imagine that this is one of the many challenges of modern slavery, is that it's so hard to find. It exists in so many places, but it's hard to find. As we shop for ourselves and businesses look to procure items from around the world, are there particular characteristics that we can look out for to indicate or serve as a warning that modern slavery might exist there?
Look, realistically, it's very hard to know if a product you buy has a supply chain connected with some sort of slave practices. But usually, if you were looking at an item and thinking, that is insanely cheap, how can that item be made so cheaply?
Okay, so if it's too good to be true, it probably could be.
It probably could be. There's your first suspicion. But the reality is, Adam, that slave labour is just in so many supply chains. And we, the consumer, do have a role to play in its prevalence. So we do need to start changing the way we shop and prioritising where we spend our money. So shopping with businesses that are transparent, examine their supply chains, and we've got the option to buy fair trade or locally sourced products. In Australia, if you buy local and buy Australian, while modern slavery practices do exist, they're rare and they are far less prevalent than in other countries. Other ways to buy slave-free products include researching the brands you buy and their supply chain arrangements and the brand's commitment to anti-slavery practices and transparency in their supply chains. And this is becoming an increasingly important aspect for consumers. We do care more that our goods are sourced in an ethically fair way. And recently there has been a new coalition formed called the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And it is a new organisation formed by Microsoft, Coca-Cola and Google. And effectively they're basically saying we want to eradicate these practices from our supply chains.
Well, that is some heavyweight support.
Heavyweight support. So I think if we can see more organisations join this and consumers boycotting organisations that have been found to be engaged in slavery practices, then I think you'll see organisations are going to proactively start to look to source goods that are ethically sourced without modern slavery practices in those supply chains.
Stay with me, Deborah. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Deborah Coram, Chief Executive Officer of Safetrac, Australia's leading compliance platform. So, Deborah, in terms of support, Safetrac has been working in this space for some time. How did you become involved?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Adam. It's probably a long answer, if you don't mind.
No,
I will
please.
tell you the story about how I became invested in the topic, because I think it's one that makes it very clear to others what modern slavery actually is. I first went to a compliance seminar in the States several years ago where they were talking about modern slavery practices. And I sat in a seminar transfixed by a man who told a story about a Thai fisherman. He was a young Cambodian sculptor by the name of Vanak Anamprum, who left his village to look for labouring work. And he needed enough money to pay for his wife Sokun's impending hospital stay as she got ready to give birth to their first child. And he intended to stay away for 2 months to find some work. And after a middleman in the Thai-Cambodian border promised he could earn a lot of money drying fish, Coram was sold into slave labour. He had his passport taken from him and he was sent to sea on a fishing trawler. He would not see his wife for another 5 years.
Oh, my God.
On that fishing trawler, he was forced to work around the clock through storms, allowed a maximum of 2 hours sleep by day and 2 hours by night. Violence was what caused these people to work those hours, in that if you weren't, people were murdered in front of him and thrown overboard. People were worked on that ship until they either died through exhaustion or through violence, where again their bodies are thrown overboard. One night, Coram decided that his life choice was better to jump off that boat in the middle of the sea and try and escape than he was continuing to work on that boat. He did jump off that trawler and managed to swim to escape, only to be sold by his rescuers into slavery on a palm plantation on the Malaysian coast. Eventually, he was one of the lucky ones who was miraculously rescued by a Cambodian human rights organisation. And his survival meant that he was actually able to tell the story of what was happening on these fishing trawlers, where we buy our cheap prawns and seafood from. And that story to me went, wow, I have been buying cheap prawns from overseas markets. I'm not going to do that ever again. And from that point, I changed my consumer behaviour.
So, Deborah, was this a contemporary story or is this a long time ago?
This happened in 2011.
Wow.
It's a real story. And
so in the last 10 years, this has happened?
Absolutely. And this practice is widespread. So he has gone on to tell his story, to write a book, and his story has enabled many people to realise these practices that are
I hope he got to see his wife and healthy child at some point.
He did. He has been returned to his wife and child and has now been telling this story. Now, I'm grateful now, Adam, that our Australian government has been one of the first governments to pass legislation in this area with the implementation of the Modern Slavery Act in 2018. Now, upon its implementation, we immediately at Safetrac produced a training course so we could train corporations and their staff in modern slavery practices to make them aware of it. And to date, we've trained hundreds of corporations and hundreds and thousands of staff on the topic. And the more people are aware and familiar of it, the more we can move to eradicate it. We've also subsequently built a tool to assist companies in auditing their own compliance with the legislation and created a supply chain audit tool which enables companies to conduct due diligence questions across their supply chains, gather all the responses, assess the risks, and use the data to help prepare their modern slavery reports.
Okay, Deborah, this training in particular, who is required to do it? And does it target particular sectors in Australia? Is it based on revenues or what are the criteria involved?
Yeah, look, under the current legislation, Adam, the only organisations that are required to report under the Modern Slavery Act are those with revenues exceeding $100 million.
Okay.
Now, other entities may choose to report voluntarily. Now, it's interesting what we saw in the last reporting period, Adam, is that even though only organisations with a revenue over 100 million are required to report, it demanded that those organisations audited all their supply chains. And that audit required that those supply chains audit their supply chains. So many organisations, regardless of their size, were caught up in having to train their staff in what modern slavery practices were and how to audit their supply chain and how to do a due diligence on their supply chain to look for modern slavery practices within it. So its impact has been widespread and much greater than just that sector over that financial amount.
So how does a company identify if there is modern slavery in their supply chain? What does the reporting and the investigations look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's an individual factor left up to each company really, but there is structure to the reports and what has to be contained within them.
So it's like a series of steps that you must follow?
Yeah, so you have to identify who the reporting entity is, the structure, the operations, and the supply chains of that entity. They then need to report on the risks of modern slavery practices in their own operations and their supply chains of their own entity and any entities that reporting entity owns or controls. So it's quite widespread. And then they need to report upon the actions taken by those entities around about how they're going to control, assess and address those risks. They then must report on the effectiveness of those actions, and they need to report on the process of consultation with any entities the reporting entity owns or controls in issuing a joint modern slavery statement, and then any other information that the reporting entity or the entity giving the statement considers relevant. So in effect, those statements have to explain what the entity is doing to assess and address the risks of modern slavery practices that may be occurring in its global or domestic operations and supply chains.
Okay.
And the operations and supply chains of any entity it owns.
So there is work involved, but this is good work. It's the right thing to do. Let's say a company finds a risk of modern slavery. What do they do then? How do they tackle it? Is it a matter of reporting it to authorities, moving their business, or a range of different things that they should do?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Adam, and it's not a simple answer. Really gaining transparency over our supply chains and operations is only the first step to tackling it. And realistically, once an organisation looks into their operations and supply chains, they will detect modern slavery risks and instances. It's not a might, they will.
Right.
And there is no silver bullet or one set of answers on how those companies can respond, but there are a number of ideas. And the UN guiding principles on business and human rights states that when a company does come across this, they have a responsibility to prevent action or harm to the victims of those practices. So a company turning around and boycotting those suppliers and saying, well, we're not going to use you again, is kind of a knee-jerk reaction, which doesn't actually stop that company from using that modern slavery practice. The people, the victims, are still caught in that cycle. And so really it's incumbent on the business to try and work with that business to stop those victims being slaves. So it might be, if this is the way you're treating people, we will continue to work with you, but we want to ensure these people are being paid a wage. We want to see the wage these people are being paid. There might be practical things that ensures the health and well-being of the victims and doesn't allow that company to just turn and supply those services to another supplier.
Gotcha. And is there somewhere, in addition to that step and seeking to evolve the commercial business, is there an authority or a body to which that issue should be reported?
Look, the actual filing of the statements is in itself a publication of these practices.
Gotcha.
So all of the statements are filed and available, and they are available to the general public. So there is a real sort of name and shame, if you like, going on, but it's also that companies can work together to identify practices and work together to solve them. So it's sort of like a company's not alone in experiencing these issues. They're not a bad company because they're involved in their supply chains. If they are doing something willfully to eradicate them, then that is helping the victims that are currently involved in it. If we just turn our back to the victims and say we're not going to use that company anymore, we don't free those victims from that servitude.
So for the efforts that are being made so far, are there signs that modern slavery efforts are working? Is it getting better?
Look, I think it's too early to tell, Adam. We've only just completed our first reporting period, and there have been multiple instances of modern slavery practices being recognised. and of companies working to change those practices, but it's on a very small scale. And truly, with only Australia, the UK and California implementing legislation, there's just not enough global impetus to make a difference. We need to change consumer awareness to change our demand, and we need to address the issues which keep people in exploitation and prevent them from leaving. And that involves in changing employment laws in other countries. So it's a very widespread issue that we have a long way to tackle, that we are only just beginning to scratch the surface.
Right. So really we're only just getting started.
We sure are.
Deborah, thank you so much for talking to Fear and Greed this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, Adam.
That was Deborah Coram, the Chief Executive Officer of Safetrac, Australia's leading compliance platform. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join Sean Aylmer every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Adam Lang. Enjoy your day.